Happy October, everyone. Who's ready to celebrate Halloween like never before? Horror movies have been a personal passion of mine for years now, and while I love watching them, discussing them in depth sometimes is even more enjoyable. This is why I review many of them on this very channel, but while I love doing that, I like to go beyond just one simple movie or one franchise even, and talk about the broader history of the genre as a whole. And so I'd like to invite you all to this brand new series, Terror Time, where I'll be doing exactly that. And in this first episode, I've got a pretty fascinating topic, so let's jump right into it. The history of the horror genre, as I said, really has enraptured me, in particular when you divide it into different eras and time periods. Each decade seems to have a unique development that forever changes horror, for better or worse. From the German expressionism of the 20s to the monster craze of the 40s, the B-movies and sci-fi flicks of the 50s and 60s, and the slashers of the 70s and 80s, these are all very fun to dig into and learn about, but one particular era, or craze as I like to call it, caught my attention for this first episode. I'm of course talking about the 1980s and the hysteria surrounding the so-called video nasties. Since the dawn of horror movies, violence has been included. Even in one of the first truly notable and amazing landmark titles, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, there are murders depicted. Sure, they're subtle, but it's not exactly G-rated either. What's interesting is that while these movies do indeed include violence, they probably wouldn't get any grandma to clutch her pearls nowadays. In fact, now most people consider them classics. But back then, they were a lot more shocking and possibly controversial. However, horror wasn't exactly considered a plague on the youth during these early decades. Surely there was still some level of prudish backlash toward the genre, but by the 50s and 60s, the transition from cutting-edge cinematic masterpieces like Nosferatu, Caligari, Dracula, or even M, to silly B-movies caused many to look down upon horror and consider it cheap entertainment, rather than the extremely artistically strong movement that it had started out as. But everything seemed to change with Alfred Hitchcock, who managed to offer a 1960s alternative to the cheap and often terrible B-movies that were running rampant, instead shocking audiences with intricate thriller-style plotlines, crazy twists, and yes, a lot of violence. This is where we can start to see what I describe as the first real artistic civil war in the horror genre, one that continues to this day. Cheap and exploitative schlock versus thoughtful, though often brutal and disturbing artistry. It's not quite the same today, but I'd argue it evolved into the current conflict between more tame and predictable mainstream horror films and the indie ones that often push boundaries and express profound ideas. As Hitchcock's films like Psycho depicted more visceral violence than had really ever been seen before for the purpose of good storytelling, people began to push back against it. Not only did the film begin after an unmarried couple engaged in sexual intercourse, something that was truly unheard of for a film to do in 1960, but it also showed multiple violent murders. Sure, it's quite tame today, but look at this and compare it to Dracula. If people in the 30s thought Dracula was almost too much, Psycho 30 years later wasn't going to land well with everyone. And while it's today known as a masterpiece among many, it was very controversial at the time, and beyond simple depictions of sex and violence, it was also extremely influential with how it, for perhaps the first time in a major motion picture, discussed the issue of gender nonconformity with one of its lead characters. Psycho was basically the genesis of the slasher genre, which, as we shall see, is sort of the entire reason for the video nasties craze. Then, 8 years later, during one of the most tumultuous years in American history, full of racial and in turn political division, another landmark title was released called Night of the Living Dead. Though it was made somewhat cheaply, it had truly phenomenal special effects, ideas, and the best sense of suspense of that era outside of Hitchcock. It essentially began the zombie subgenre, which was another major target of the craze alongside slashers. Our story picks back up in the year 1973 with the release of a beloved movie, The Exorcist. Though it includes a ton of gore and some profanity, as well as a generally very brutal and dark subject matter, it received widespread praise, deservedly so, for its special effects and acting. It wasn't without its controversies and backlash, but the religious influence definitely diminished the hatred toward it and paved the way for it to even win multiple Academy Awards. The genre seemed to be gaining the respect it deserved in small increments, as both The Exorcist and Jaws were nominated for Best Picture in 1973 and 75 respectively. However, in the middle of these two widely loved titles, there was one outsider that would change the history of horror and, dare I say, all of cinema forever. His name? Leatherface. During the era of Nixon and Ford, the era of strong counterculture fighting back against an increasingly hostile status quo, Tobe Hooper and his crew went to hell and back to create something truly magnificent known as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This movie is the first case we're talking about where, while it is widely beloved today, it was not a critical success at all. The LA Times claimed that it was despicable, and many were absolutely horrified and disgusted by the supposed violence involved. But wait a minute. I've seen this movie like 3 times now, and I don't remember it being that brutal and violent. Well, that's probably because this movie was extremely tame in terms of gore, to the point that there's not much blood used whatsoever. So what was the big fuss about? Probably what was implied rather than what was shown. We see multiple murders in this movie, some of them truly gruesome, but only because of what we infer to have happened. We don't actually see Leatherface place the girl on the meat hook, but we know it happens, and our imaginations make it out to be so much worse than it ever could be if shown on screen. This is very smart on behalf of the filmmaker, as it makes the original Texas Chainsaw one of only 2 movies I've ever seen that legitimately frightened me after I watched it, but it didn't prevent many critics from absolutely loathing the movie, and they didn't have to do much to cause the public to turn against it as well. Perhaps it's true that these critics couldn't stomach the contents of the film, but I'd actually argue it's just as, if not more likely, that they were very much aware of the themes and messages beneath the threatening exterior and didn't want them to be heard or spread. In the vein of McCarthy, the provocative title was paired with hateful and raging reviews that condemned the movie and all involved in its making, stoking fear among the public during an already tumultuous era, and for that exact reason, those same counterculture themes weren't given a fair look for decades. The movie very clearly critiqued American inequality, exploitation, and many socioeconomic truths that were either ignored or twisted by politicians, but for a very long time, most were too afraid to go anywhere near it because they thought it would all turn them into violent murderers themselves. And that's when all hell broke loose. You see, the scariest thing to the public was now no longer the content of the horror movies they had seen. It was what they were told was contained in the ones they were too afraid to see. And that opened the floodgates for the censorship and criminalization of dozens of horror movies. But of course, in the good old US of A, none of these movies got banned. Land of the free, baby. Instead, we need to talk about the good old United Kingdom, where things really started to go crazy. About a year or so after its initial release there, it was banned outright, along with the word chainsaw in all movie titles. No, that's not a joke. They were pissing themselves with fear so much from this movie that they actually felt the need to ban the word chainsaw from all movie titles, which I guess makes it the most effective horror movie of all time. While it wasn't the first horror movie to be banned, as even Phantom of the Opera, for crying out loud, was banned because it was, quote, too horrifying, it was the start of a wider trend, mainly concentrated in the UK. Not to suggest it didn't happen in other countries. For example, Germany also banned the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but the UK experienced a cultural movement against horror movies that's quite crazy, and that's what I'm really here to discuss. In June of 1983, the UK government published a list of what they called the video nasties, which were movies that were considered obscene and thus placed into one of three groups. Group 1 consists of movies that were to be sought after, seized, and prosecuted, meaning that whoever distributed these was to be met with actual criminal charges, whereas Group 2 was only to be treated as such under the circumstance of cooperation from the distributor. So basically, Group 1 is what they thought was super bad, and Group 2 they gave the legal equivalent of the side-eye, but only actually did anything in specific cases. A lot of the movies in Group 1 are ones that no one's ever heard of and no one will ever care about. Now, do I personally agree with them criminalizing these movies? No, I think that's going too far. But I'm also not exactly going to get upset at the government for banning a movie called The Gestapo's Last Orgy. There are a few well-known ones on this list, I suppose. For example, Last House on the Left, Bay of Blood, and I Spit on Your Grave. Again, I think it's a bad idea to go as far as they did, but even these more famous films aren't usually known for being that high quality. Exploitation films are really what they targeted, and while there are movies that you could technically consider exploitative that are still very good, I generally understand why people might not hold these ones in high regard. So Group 1 doesn't really get my knickers in a twist, but Group 2 is where we start to see some objectionable inclusions. Of course, there are still lots of trashy, cheesy movies on this list as well, and basically you can tell it's an exploitation movie if the poster has a woman on it who's in a state I can't show on YouTube. Or, well, I guess a man in the case of this Nightmare Maker movie, so there you go. Equal rights. Look, I don't want to write off any of these movies immediately, right out the gate, without having even seen them. Well, maybe except for the ones inside of the frighteningly real Nazi exploitation subgenre, but let's just say most of these are not beloved classics being banned by a fascist government. They're pieces of shit that no one cares about. That is, with one glaring exception. One movie that is beloved among horror fans the world over. A classic. One I have hanging up on my wall, I think. That's right. I'm talking about Killer Nun. No, I'm actually talking about the original Evil Dead, which I'd argue is a movie with some exploitative elements, and in fact, one that I've reviewed before. And while I admire the movie and adore its sequels, I'm not that big of a fan of the original film by itself, but I think that really proves why these laws were stupid more than anything else. Even though it's thematically exploitative, there's a pretty clear gap in quality and inventiveness between this and the other movies on the list. The movies that exploit Nazi concentration camps, yeah, honestly, I don't care if you ban those. But something like Killer Nun is definitely way worse and less passionately made than Evil Dead. Well, how do you know that, Walter? How can you be so sure? You've never even given the poor movie a chance. Okay, first off, how the hell did you get in my house? And second off, you're actually not wrong. I guess there's really only one way to know for sure, and that would be to review Killer Nun. And review a stupid horror movie and waste my life doing that? Whew. You know how to get me excited. But maybe that's why it's not fair of me to call this an exploitation movie. It's made to be an interesting and fantastical horror film that has a lot of craftsmanship behind it with the special effects and camera work. That's a lot different than a movie that's basically made for people to go yank on their, remote in the movie theater. It is still very gross, though, I will admit, like seriously disgusting, so I can kind of understand why it wouldn't exactly avoid targeting from a puritanical Tory government run by, well, not the Carbon Lady, that's for sure. But we still have one final list to look at, and this is where things get, dare I say, nasty. The third list is what they actually called the Video Nasties list, and all these movies were allowed to be seized by the government and could still be used to hand out lesser obscenity charges, so these movies were still very much under attack. And looking through this list, you'll see some more movies that no one's ever heard of, and it all seems kind of normal until, wait a second. Dawn of the Dead? Yes, The beloved sequel to the amazing Night of the Living Dead, this movie was considered a video nasty, and the egregious entries don't end there. Friday the 13th 1 and 2, The Hills Have Eyes, Phantasm, Suspiria, John Carpenter's The Thing, and yes, my beloved Texas Chainsaw. These are all very famous films, many of them extremely beloved and high quality, and yet they were basically treated as contraband by the government, showcasing the broader disdain for horror that swept not just the UK, but the entire media world. And they weren't being fair at all. Just because some of these are quite violent doesn't mean it's justified to ban them, especially considering how they even banned the original Night of the Living Dead, even though it had come out 15 years before this list was even published. And if you watch this video showing a news show involving Sam Raimi and the controversy surrounding his Evil Dead movies, you'll see just how out of touch these politicians were surrounding this issue. This craze not only shows disdain for an amazing genre, though, it represents more broadly these regressive attempts to silence unique artistic voices and ideas that went against the norms of the time, and that goes way beyond just a few silly movies. And now I want to finish up by talking about the broader impacts of this moral panic and how it and the general reaction toward the prominence of exploitation films completely ravaged the horror genre. With two exceptions, since 1975, a horror movie was never nominated again for Best Picture, and the two that were are lighter horror experiences that I personally would more so classify as mystery and thriller films respectively. People for years and years have gotten upset over horror movies, at least until violent video games took up their vitriol instead, and it shows. The horror genre has been essentially treated like a taboo, like some kind of gross niche that only freaks indulge in, rather than an artistically rich side of the art of film. But think about it. Would the government ban Edgar Allan Poe today? Of course not. Would they ban The Evil Dead today? Well, in most countries at least, no. But now we're seeing other things that governments want to go after. It seems to be a constantly spinning cycle of outrage toward one thing, where horror was once the scapegoat, and it has never fully recovered in the public eye. But from an artistic perspective, it was never once tarnished by this. In fact, it was only made stronger by the hate toward it. Art isn't always meant to be comforting and happy. Sometimes brutality, darkness, and terror are more important to witness, as horror can, just like any other type of movie, tell us a lot about the human condition. And it 100% in the last few years has. From Dr. Caligari over 100 years ago to movies I've seen just this year, this genre will always have a special place in my heart, in the hearts of millions of others, and no law will ever be able to stop that. The ideas and the artistic value behind all of these movies will live on, will remain on the right side of history forever. And despite all the controversy, artists will continue to make art regardless of if it makes the Tories happy or not. This has been Terror Time. Thanks for watching, and keep on terrifying till time tends to terminate. Goodbye.